Welcome to SOC Minute Weekly. I'm Alex, and we've got a packed run today with a few stories that make routine patching and trust boundaries feel a lot less routine.
We're looking at urgent flaws in widely used platforms, active exploitation affecting security infrastructure, and some more unusual tradecraft around developer ecosystems and AI agents. There's also a thread running through the episode about how much damage follows when systems or identities get more access than they really need.
The first one lands right on that access theme. WP2 shell is described as a WordPress core flaw that lets an unauthenticated attacker execute code, even on a default install, with no plugins.
Which is the part that makes people pause. WordPress incidents often start with a plugin inventory, and that's still useful generally, but it doesn't narrow this one down. The reported scope is core, so a plain installation is in scope too.
I was surprised by the forced auto updates. WordPress has issued 6.9.5 and 7.0.2 and enabled them, but I wouldn't treat that as proof every exposed site is already fixed.
No, auto update status can be disabled, blocked, or simply fail. I'd want an asset list, the running version, and confirmation that the update actually applied. Then look back through web server and application logs for unusual requests or code activity.
And because the reported path is unauthenticated code execution, the urgent question isn't whether someone has an admin account. It's whether the site was reachable before the patch landed.
Exactly. The source says this is an urgent patch situation, but it doesn't establish exploitation of any particular site. Still, that exposure window is enough to justify checking for follow-on activity, not just closing the version gap.
That same "don't just patch and move on" point carries over here, except CISA says these two FortiSandbox flaws are actively exploited. Federal agencies have a deadline this Sunday, which is about as clear a signal as you get that this has moved past theoretical risk.
And FortiSandbox can be easy to overlook because it's a security appliance, not the application people are watching every day. I'd start by proving where every instance is, including anything isolated, retired in name only, or managed by a separate infrastructure team. Then verify the actual installed patch level, not a ticket that says it was scheduled.
I was thinking about the monitoring side too. If an appliance that analyzes suspicious files gets compromised, the concern isn't only the box itself. It may sit close to email, file transfer, or investigation workflows.
Careful though. The available details don't tell us what access exploitation produces or what downstream activity has occurred. We shouldn't fill that in. But active exploitation is enough to review its logs, administrative access, configuration changes, and unusual outbound connections while remediation is underway.
Right. The deadline applies to federal agencies, but the exploitation status is the part enterprise defenders shouldn't dismiss. The awkward question is whether their asset inventory even labels FortiSandbox clearly enough to find it quickly. That asset inventory problem has a cousin here. Developers often pull down coding test material outside the places we watch closely. In this contagious interview activity, the fake challenge included SVG flag images carrying hidden malicious code, leading into a multi-stage payload aligned with Otter Cookie.
And SVG is the uncomfortable detail. People hear image and mentally downgrade the risk, but SVG is XML-based and can carry active content. That doesn't mean every SVG in a repository is suspect. Plenty are legitimate. The concern is the context, an unsolicited recruitment test asking someone to run or inspect a project.
I was surprised by how well that fits the target. A developer expects dependencies, sample assets, odd build behavior. A staged payload can hide among things that look like normal challenge files.
Exactly, though we shouldn't assume the reporting proves every execution path or the eventual impact in each case. It ties the activity to the campaign and says the payload is Otter Cookie aligned. Attribution and downstream access are related, but they're not the same claim.
So if someone reports a sketchy coding exercise, I'd want the original archive, hashes, the SVGs themselves, and endpoint process and network history around when it was opened. Then, check authentication activity afterward, especially for developer accounts.
And don't limit the hunt to known malware names. The useful pivot may be recruitment-themed downloads followed by unexpected child processes or outbound connections. The hard part is that much of that first interaction happens on a personal device before any corporate telemetry exists.
The contrast with that fake job campaign is pretty sharp. Here, the target isn't a person getting lured in. It's the law enforcement environment itself. Researchers found espionage activity against Pakistani police infrastructure from suspected China and India-aligned groups, with police servers handling critical data reportedly compromised.
And multiple groups matters, but I'd be careful not to turn that into a claim they were coordinating. Overlapping interest in the same police systems can look messy from the defender's side, even when the actors are completely separate. Attribution in this kind of reporting is usually a confidence call, not a clean organizational chart.
Still, it's a rough place to have overlapping access. Police systems can hold investigative records, personnel information, case data, maybe operational details. We aren't told exactly what was accessed or taken, so I wouldn't fill that in, but the intelligence value is obvious.
For the people watching those servers, I'd start with the unglamorous work. Identify every affected or related asset, then line up authentication logs and network connections over time. You're looking for unusual administrator access, odd remote paths, and activity that doesn't fit the server's role.
And not just one familiar indicator. If more than one suspected actor is involved, a hunt built around a single toolkit could miss the other presence entirely.
Exactly. The uncomfortable question is whether the available logs go back far enough to separate those threads.
That log retention question carries over here, because routers are one of those places where people assume the device is quiet, therefore it's fine. These FSB Center 16 linked actors are reportedly going after poorly configured routers in critical sectors worldwide, including through legacy SNMP and Cisco Smart Install.
And poorly configured can hide a lot. The source doesn't say every exposed router is compromised or that disruption has occurred. But those services can reveal useful device information or provide an access path that shouldn't exist at all. For an espionage-focused actor, that's plenty worth checking.
Cisco Smart Install is the one that makes me pause. If it's still enabled because it was needed years ago, it may not show up in anyone's normal application inventory. Then somebody starts scanning for it, and the first alert is just odd traffic to a network device.
Assuming the network device logs are collected, which gets us back to the prior problem, I'd want to separate current exposure from historical investigation. Identify legacy SNMP, find smart install use, and check which routers are externally reachable. The agencies are urging those hygiene steps now, but the advisory alone doesn't establish how long any given environment has been exposed.
Right. And router telemetry is often thinner than endpoint telemetry, which makes quiet access especially uncomfortable. Then we go from infrastructure at the edge to developers pulling code into the build chain. That jump from thin router logs to the build chain is uncomfortable in a different way. Here, researchers found 7 malicious NPM packages in the Vite ecosystem, tied to a campaign they call Vite Venom, and the payload path ends in a rat.
The part that changes the investigation is the command and control design. It reportedly uses 4 layers and blockchain as part of the C2 infrastructure. So this isn't just, did a developer install a bad package? You also have to consider whether any affected endpoint later made blockchain-related connections that don't fit its normal role.
And that could be messy telemetry. A developer workstation might legitimately run all kinds of tooling, but a build server reaching out in a pattern consistent with C2 is a very different conversation.
I'd be careful not to treat all blockchain traffic as proof. The source doesn't give us package names or specific indicators here, and blockchain use by itself isn't malicious. But it does mean a simple domain blocking mindset may miss the point.
Right. I'd start by finding where those 7 packages landed. Lock files, package manifests, CI artifacts, internal registries, cached installs. Then correlate that with endpoint alerts and outbound network activity.
Exactly. The package discovery tells you exposure. The C2 question tells you whether it became a compromise. And with a layered setup, absence of one obvious network indicator may not settle it. That last point about not relying on one network indicator carries over here, just in a different environment. With IoT, people often have less endpoint telemetry to begin with, so a botnet can blend into a pretty thin monitoring picture.
TuxBot v3 evolution apparently shows signs that a large language model helped build parts of the framework, even with a safety disclaimer in the generated material. I admit, the disclaimer is almost beside the point. The interesting part is that someone may be using an LLM to speed up botnet development.
I'd be careful not to turn that into AI made a new class of malware. The reporting points to apparent assistance, not proof that the model independently produced a capable botnet. But it can lower the effort for writing, revising, or adapting code, and that matters when the targets are broadly exposed IoT devices.
So the detection problem may not be some magical AI signature. It's still compromised devices making unusual outbound connections, reaching unexpected destinations, or behaving unlike their normal role.
Exactly. Start with an inventory, because you can't investigate traffic from devices you don't know exist. Then separate ordinary vendor cloud traffic from connections that don't fit. For TuxBot variants, threat intel can help, but behavior may be the more durable signal if the code keeps changing.
And IoT is where that gets uncomfortable. A device can sit quietly for months, with nobody looking closely at what it's doing. That long, quiet device problem carries over here, just in a less visible way. Abbott says it's investigating unauthorized access involving legacy Exact Sciences systems, and, separately, its Lab Central portal. Attackers are claiming they took company data and are making extortion claims.
The separation matters. 2 incidents don't automatically mean one intrusion path, one actor, or even the same dataset. Public claims can be useful leads, but they're not confirmation of what was accessed or taken.
Still, legacy systems plus a portal in a healthcare diagnostics environment is a rough combination. I'd want the asset inventory nailed down first. What is actually inherited Exact Sciences infrastructure? What talks to it? And whether the portal has separate identity and logging paths.
And don't stop at successful logins. Look for unusual authentication patterns, admin changes, service account use, and outbound transfers that don't fit normal diagnostic workflows. If retention is thin on older systems, that's where investigation gets frustrating fast.
I also wouldn't jump straight to ransomware. The facts here are unauthorized access, alleged data theft, and extortion claims. Encryption or a specific malware family isn't established.
Exactly. The immediate concern is validating exposure and scoping the 2 environments without assuming they're connected. In healthcare, the data question can become more consequential than the initial access question.
That distinction around exposure carries over here, except the thing getting altered may be the assistant's view of the user. MemGhost is described as using a single email to plant false, persistent information in an AI agent's memory, then letting it shape later replies.
And that's more than a bad answer in one chat. If the memory persists, the original email can disappear into normal message volume, while the assistant keeps acting on a false premise. The source calls it undetected, but I'd be careful with that wording. It shows the risk, not that every assistant handles memory the same way.
I hadn't thought about the investigation problem. You may need the inbound email, the agent's memory state, and a history of outputs just to establish when behavior changed. If those pieces aren't logged together, you're reconstructing intent from an assistant that may now be confidently wrong.
Exactly. I'd start by identifying which assistants can ingest email and write durable memory. Then look for unusual instructions or claims in those inputs. But response drift matters too, especially when the agent suddenly treats an unverified detail as settled fact.
That's rough, because users may trust the personalization without seeing the poisoned source.
And it leads directly to the next question. Once an agent can remember things, what tools is that remembered context allowed to influence?
That's the part that caught me. Memory by itself is bad enough, but it becomes much more serious when the agent can turn that context into actions. If an email can steer its judgment, I don't want that same agent holding broad access to mailboxes, repositories, ticketing, and production tools.
Right. And the agent can't be one oversized service identity. Microsoft's point on least privilege and tool binding is pretty grounded. Give an agent only the specific tools it needs, with narrowly scoped permissions, rather than letting a general-purpose identity reach everything it might conceivably be asked to do.
Tool binding sounds simple until you look at how these systems get deployed. A helpful agent might need to read a case, summarize it, open a ticket, maybe query an attorney system. The risky jump is letting it write back, change records, or trigger something based on untrusted context.
And those are separate permissions. Reading a case is not approving a change. Creating a draft ticket is not closing an incident. We should be able to see which agent identity called which tool, on whose behalf, and with what result. Otherwise, an odd action just lands in a shared audit trail with no useful story behind it.
I'm still not sure logging alone catches a poisoned memory problem, though.
It may not, but it gives us a way to spot an agent using a tool outside its expected pattern. Least privilege limits the blast radius. Audit trails help explain what happened after the fact. Neither one proves the agent's reasoning was sound.
I keep coming back to the same theme. Finding the exposed thing is only the first half. A WordPress version, a FortiSandbox appliance, a router, an NPM package, an agent with a tool grant. Then you still have to ask what it touched.
And whether you can answer that quickly. I'd review the asset inventory this week, especially the systems people tend to label vaguely. Security appliances, edge devices, legacy web services, and AI agent integrations. If you can't find them, patching and scoping both get slow.
For the agent side, I'd also look at what remembered context can actually influence. Not whether the assistant seems harmless in a test, but which tools it can invoke, and whether those calls are logged.
That's a sensible place to leave it. SOC Minute's useful when it helps turn a headline into one thing worth checking before it becomes someone's long weekend. Stay safe, stay informed, stay secure.